the demo next. You can.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and welcome to my talk about my master thesis and what complexities I encountered during motocross and motion capturing. So first, a bit about the project background and how the idea evolved. So you've already heard a bit about how motion capturing is a valuable and really powerful tool to understand human motion and to gain insights in order to aid the performance enhancement or development in the sports sector. So talking about development, nowadays, especially in the mobility sector, we rely heavily on virtual domains. That is really apparent in the simulation of aerodynamics, structural mechanics, or material science as seen in those pictures. But the thing about motocross is it's all about the symbiotic relationship between the motorcycle and the rider. And the thing with the rider is it is not really included yet in all the simulations, calculations. So either there is no rider at all, or it is simplified to a point mass, for example, or it is, even if there is a simple multi-body model like the one on the picture, those are static, simplified, and not really based on actual measurement data, but more on assumptions and guesses what is happening. So there is a huge knowledge gap about the rider kinematics and in general the kinematics of the motorcycle and the rider during the dynamic activity. So that was kind of the research question with which KTM approached me and said, okay, we kind of want to figure out what is happening actually. So that is how I got to work on the project, because in my studies in biomedical engineering and later in sports technology, I've already worked a lot with motion analysis, study design, and data analysis. So that's how I took that on as my master thesis. So coming already to the first and the main challenge, why do we do that in the field? So basically the problem with the lab is we cannot replicate motocross in a lab, because for that we need a huge track, we are outdoors, and we are basically jumping through the air, and that cannot happen in a laboratory. The only thing that we could do in a lab is looking at some static poses, postures, default sitting or standing positions, but really only in a static way that is not really realistic. So if we go to the field, we can basically follow the whole movement, the whole dynamic activity really well with wearables, as we've heard with the IMUs, that in general can work really well, but we have to take into account many complex factors that play a role here and that we will look at now. But first a bit about the measurement setup that has to be developed. Like for my main study, I had 2 professional motocross riders, and we looked at 2 motorcycle variants that we wanted to compare, like if we maybe directly see a difference between those 2. And the measurement system we used was a full-body inertial measurement system with 17 sensors that were connected via cables and that were placed on each body segment. And we also put 2 of the sensors on the motorcycle, as we initially, of course, wanted to see, okay, what is the relationship between the rider and the vehicle, and how do they move in relation to each other. So the first big issue, it was a process to figure out how to place the sensors, of course, because the manufacturer does not exactly think that you take the system and you go extreme sports motocross riding in the field with it. So we had to work around the protective gear, like in motocross you wear leg braces, you have maybe a protector vest, and then on top even a jersey, pants and stuff. So we had to figure out where to even put the sensors, and then we kind of got to the point where we said, okay, we have to put the sensors over the leg braces and kind of figure out a way that the sensor positions are still precise enough to represent the limbs, like the legs, the forearms, very well. But it has to be fixed and secure and protected also to not get tangled up in the cables during the action. So once that was figured out, we also then decided to use an on-body recording mode so that we are independent of any PC station or range limitation of the wireless recording mode or whatever. So the advantage there was that we were able to measure several consecutive laps on the track. So we could measure for half an hour, 1 hour. But the tricky thing was if something breaks in between, if something does not work, we find out like 1 or 2 days later, and then unlucky. So from what I've told now, you've already got a bit of an idea what can be complex here, but here's a big overview of the major influence factors in looking at the rider kinematics. Of course, the rider niveau, like the level of professionality they're riding at, is a really central aspect, because that also determines their technique and how they move, how fast they are on the circuit, and that can already make a big difference in the results and how the kinematics look. Also the anthropometry, so basically the height, the body type, and any measurements of the rider play also a role and have to be taken into account. The complexity of the movement is also like basically the biggest point, because on such a track there is a lot of stuff happening, a lot of different obstacles, a lot of different movements, and that can just be a lot that we have to look at. Also the vehicle characteristics, so the different specifications of the motorcycle they are riding on. And then maybe the biggest point, like the sensor accuracy, and that's not only about the sensitivity or like the specifications of the sensor, but like I've mentioned a bit with the placement, and also then the processing method, so the way that we analyze the data and the way we look at it then determines how the research question is answered or how the outcome looks. And as external factors that are also not that easy to control are the track characteristics and weather influence and ground conditions. So diving directly into the track characteristics, so the layout of the track is a big factor, as this already determines the difficulty on the track and the obstacles that are encountered. And yeah, based on that, the riders adapt, of course, like the speed or the technique they use or the movements they do. And that way we cannot compare different tracks to one another. So even if, of course, every track has a jump or every track has a corner, you cannot compare those, because the surrounding elements heavily influence how you approach them. And therefore, for proper comparison, always just using the same track, the same elements. Something really hard to control are the ground conditions. In general, every track has a different ground. It can be a heavier soil, it can be more like sand. And then if the weather comes into play or the track is watered overnight, it can happen that the track is super wet, it gets muddy, then the mud sticks to the motorcycle is heavier, the whole driving behavior changes a lot. And yeah, that also influences a lot the technique used and how the vehicle is handled and how the riding looks then. So coming to the anthropometry, so if we say we want to eliminate a lot of those different variables, so we say we use the same motorcycle for all test subjects, but then of course not all test subjects are the same height. So if persons of different height are sitting on the same bike, of course the body position is a bit different. You probably know it from a bicycle that doesn't fit you. So what we might take into account here is looking at default positions, like I've said, those static measurements in the lab, we could use to establish a relationship between the height and between the joint angles that are found in those defined positions. So that could really help to eliminate some variation in results that we might find. Then also related to those posture things, what I've found out about the riding technique, really interesting on the example of cornering. We have in motorcycle riding and also in motocross two totally different types of taking a corner. For one, we see For one, we can see that the rider is pushing the motorcycle down beneath him, so the axis of the upper body is not in line with the motorcycle anymore, and the other type would be that the upper body stays completely in line with the motorcycle, the leg is extended, and so it's just leaning with the bike. And the interesting thing is that this was observed within the same corner, the same maneuver, but my two subjects did totally different things. Amazing. So this is one of the main issues that I encountered when I looked at the data. If my two subjects are not doing the same thing, I cannot analyze the data like as it is one group, and I have to just individually look what I can take from those results. So as I'm talking already about maneuvers like cornering, of course the question is, how do I even select the features? Because we are measuring constantly for several rounds, but we want to kind of cut out the features. So what I had to think about is, for example, for a jump, where does it begin? Does it begin when the hill slope starts to increase, or in the middle, or just when the wheels lift off the ground? So I found out that there could be two approaches. I called it location-based and movement-based. And location-based would be to look at the GPS trajectory, as we measured the GPS via sensor as well. And what I did there is I looked at the satellite view on the track, and you can see quite well on the satellite view where there is a hill for the jump or a corner. And then I basically defined some threshold coordinates from which I said, okay, when the rider crosses this coordinate, this counts now as the jump. So the thing about that is we can see differences in the movement timing very well, because it doesn't matter what the rider is doing, but just where he is. You will see that on the next slide then in more detail. And the movement-based approach would be a bit like backwards, because for that you have to know what the rider is doing, because that approach would mean you set the threshold for a certain acceleration or for a certain joint angle and say, okay, if that joint angle is realized, then it counts as a jump or entering the corner. But for that, we have to know the movement patterns. And well, what I did was I wanted to find out the movement patterns, so I decided to go with the location-based approach. Here again, you can see on the left that that the red box would look at the location of the jump and not of what the rider is doing. And yeah, the graphs show now an exemplary result of the hip flexion that we found. The exact values are not that important right now. The y-axis displays like the range of motion of the hip joint that was found during the activity. And what I want to point out here is we had those two different motorcycle variants. And with the blue one, we can see pretty well the movement pattern. Like we can see a bit where the takeoff is estimated at about like 5 to 10% of the maneuver. And we can see the impact where the shock is absorbed from the jump. And yeah, considering that those were 6 or 7 laps, we have a pretty slim standard deviation, so a really good resolution of the movement pattern. But for the red one, we have some troubles determining that perfect pattern because of the difference in timing. So on the left graph, you see that in general, the shape of the curve looks the same, but it is just shifted in time. And therefore, we cannot really well see the movement when we average all those laps. So that is a bit the problem with the averaging of several laps, that the consistency is not always given. So it happens that in some laps, something happened, and that led to just a different kind of riding, and then we cannot really look at the average anymore. So coming a bit to the movement complexity, I always like to compare what I did, my activity, with things I did in my study program, like some classics, gait analysis, analyzing walking or running. Those are really pleasant to work with because it is really well studied. There are tons of publications and studies about all kinds of walking and running with different velocities and stuff. So, for example, here the curve of the knee angle, this is something that's always basically the same, and it's really well understood. And also similar to that, cycling. The knee angle during cycling almost looks like a sine wave throughout the crank cycle. And in comparison, this is just a charm to work with. We talk about the data. And when I compare that to what I get, it gets pretty complicated, because when we look at the whole track, it's just tons of different segments we could analyze. And if I took out 3 pieces, like the jump, the tight corner, and the wide corner, everything already looks totally different. We can see for the jump on the top left, the pretty nice pattern of like the flight phase and then the landing again. But also what we see is between the vehicles, red and blue, that there is some difference. But it is really hard, of course, to put a finger on it, like why is there a difference? Because of all those effects that we have all around. Or when we look at the bottom right, we can see the blue curve at a low angle. That means that he just completed the corner completely standing. And with the red one, he sat down about the apex. And then the question is, of course, okay, why was that happening? Why is he doing something completely different with the other bike? And those are things that happened a lot that, with my 2 subjects, which is not a lot, that one was doing different things than the other. So that's really a bit of an issue there. Of course, it is great to show that in general, the application of the system works really well. And we really get insights into the movement, but it is hard to say, to spot already some differences between parameters or something. So adding to the movement complexity even more, well, we wanted to look at the rider-vehicle interaction, and that's also why we put the sensors on the motorcycle, because of course we wanted to see how that is moving in relation to each other. But the tough thing here was that the sensors on the motorcycle cannot determine its location, it can only say the orientation. So we have to put in a lot of computational efforts to put that into the correct relations ourselves and to know, okay, where is the center of mass of the rider, let's say, in relation to the motorcycle. So that would be really amazing insights for the development, but it's also a long way to go and to reach that point where we can say we've established that algorithm, let's say. And yeah, about those vehicle characteristics, there are differences in frame geometry or ergonomics, component stiffment, engine displacement or suspension settings. And what is really interesting here is that when we talk to the riders, because also the subjective feedback of the riders is a really big topic in the vehicle development, because in general it's like that you take test riders and you take different components, and afterwards you ask the riders, okay, what is your opinion on that? How does it feel? And they say, okay, this component feels good, this component feels a bit worse, and this is horrible. So then mostly in the development they do what feels good. But the interesting thing would be, can we measure that, what's good? Like if the rider says, okay, it's good, what does that look like in data terms or in some results that we can put in graphs or look at it objectively? So yeah, but the issue here is, in order to try to fine-tune some of those settings and stuff, we first have to understand better the movement patterns, because we cannot try to, like I did, I had two subjects and I wanted to see the difference between two motorcycles, but that cannot work if even the two riders do not even do the same thing. So that is like the last step that we can do, but there's probably months and years along the road until we can reach that point. So throughout all of this process, I've really gained a lot of insights, or I've saw a lot of aspects that I've underestimated before, so that I've come up with a few recommendations if this research would go on in the future. So it would probably be really good to more strategically combine the lab and the field. I basically only focused on going into the field because that's what we wanted to prove. Like, okay, that's the novel application, we really want to show that works. But I think some static analysis, some really standard procedures and defined positions in the lab would really help to then later have better references for the field measurements. And probably the most difficult part is the homogeneous and large subject pool, because two professional riders is not a lot. But it is really hard to probably gain a lot of those, or to gather a lot of those subjects, because even in a company like KTM, which basically has a lot of test riders, not even there across several months, it was possible to have 10 or 20 subjects. So that's really probably the biggest challenge in that research. And then also just trying to eliminate a lot of different variables, like really focusing on the same track, the same maneuvers, even if it might be weird to go to the same track like 20 times and say, okay, we have to do the same thing again, but we cannot put in different variables and expect then consistent results. Also, instructions for technique would be important. I mean, on the one hand, we want to be realistic and let them do their thing, but of course, for the data, it would be helpful to have consistency and reproducibility. And also, coming to that anthropometry aspect, looking at the joint angles relative to those defined positions can really give better results. And also maybe looking at bigger pictures like joint coordinations, because I looked at the knee, the hip, the elbow separately, but looking at upper, lower body coordination could be really interesting insight. So basically that was it from my biggest takeaway points. I thank you so much for your attention and the interest in the topic.
Thanks a lot for all the insights. Questions again in the room. Over there.
Sorry. As far as I get, this is about having the data in real time and use it for the motorcycle and this stuff. So I think you have many data that it's really hard for processing it at the real time. Maybe you first just gathering the GPS data. So after using it and just detect the road, then use the another data for the motorcycle and the sensors. And I think it could be better that just use the sensors in the clothes. So you have to design a clothes first, then use it, because the air would be just the air would be impact in our data because it's about the speed, and when they speed up, so we have a high noise in there. So I think.
So you mean
This too.
incorporating the sensors into the fabric? for example?
Yes.
Yeah, the tricky thing about that is that the fabric is not always super, like the shirt is not always super tight, so it could even move by itself.
Okay.
So we used those kind of Velcro straps, so it was strapped down to the segments. And I'm not sure if like wind has that much impact because the sensors are in those closed cases. So I think they are developed to reduce impacts from that very well. But I think if the clothing would be perfectly tight, I think that approach would be good, like you said. We've also talked about, because this was now off-road, we've also talked about road racing, and there it would be definitely with the tighter, like leather suit, there it would be definitely directly in the suit, in the fabric. But with this kind of equipment, it's a bit tricky because sometimes it's more loose, sometimes it's more tight, depending if they have a protector or not. But good point.
Isn't it better to use less data at first?
What do you mean with less data?
Because you have the picture, you have the GPS data, you have the sensor, you have the motorcycle, and you have the recording picture from the camera, and this is too many do it for the real time.
But about real time, I'm not really sure. I cannot process real time because of that on-body recording, so I do not have in the moment the feedback of how the data looks. It is all stored on the body and later exported. So like it takes me 2 days until I can start evaluating the data. So I think this is not the point. And about analyzing the data, I always started small. I've not looked at the vehicle at first at all. I've only looked at, let's say, the knee during the jump. So only really small pieces. And then I started adding up, okay, I looked at a comparison, what does the corner look like, or what does then the hip do, or the elbow. So I've worked a bit my way up there. But
It really sounds like
yeah, of course.
business idea and discussion. We have an online question, and I really celebrate that. Please, let's continue this in the break. Okay, we have coffee break, we have lunch break, and Marie is also there at the exhibition. You have the whole day for discussing this. I'm super glad that it already come up, but I'm really curious what our online community is asking also.
Yeah, we have one question from Lucas from our online community, and it's quite a quick question. Did you also look into different styles of sport like enduro or hard enduro?
Not in this case. Like what was shortly mentioned by Christina, they looked into trial, but I only looked at motocross off-road, not enduro.
Thank you.